Tonight we're going to go over my EDL 851 case study. A summary of the case. Mrs. Stevens is a teacher and she is threatening legal action for being non-renewed because she believes that the supervision of the school has failed her and it has not helped her become a better teacher. The stakeholders in the case would be the principal, Mrs. Stevens, who is the teacher, and then also the students who are not being motivated and are not receiving a good education. It happened in Mrs. Stevens' room where the evaluations took place, and then also in the principal's office where the post-evaluation conferences were held. Let's look at some of the events that occurred. The teacher evaluation deadline was approaching, and so the principal was finishing evaluations. He was pretty happy with the majority of his staff, but found that Mrs. Stevens was not making satisfactory progress. Upon several visits, she's really not shown the ability to demand respect, to involve students, or to motivate them. When meetings with Mrs. Stevens would occur, she was very standoffish and really not open to any suggestions the principal had for improving her teaching. He decided to make one more attempt to evaluate her, and he really saw the same things. The kids were being defiant, they were not listening, they were not being motivated, and he just left after that last evaluation without speaking to Mrs. Stevens. He filled out his final evaluation and did recommend non-renewal. His meeting with Mrs. Stevens did not go well. She blamed the principal and the supervision there for her mistakes and for her poor teaching. She said it was their fault and that they had actually failed her. She threatened suing the school if the evaluation was not changed and dropped. Let's go through some of the legal and ethical issues that could exist. I think the biggest would be that Mrs. Stevens is threatening a lawsuit if the non-renewal is not dropped. We need to look at also the school policies regarding due process, and did a plan of improvement need to be implemented? Was the evaluation stringent and detailed enough to show us really a glance into Mrs. Stevens' teaching? Curious what the state laws are regarding tenure here and what documentation needed to be done so we could review these policies. And then also in our district, even though tenure does not happen in Kansas anymore, we do have a due process clause in our negotiated agreement which helps protect teachers and gives a process the administration must follow in order to non-renew. If I had to sum it up in one sentence, what I would say would be after several poor evaluations and post-evaluation conferences, Mrs. Stevens' principal has recommended non-renewal, which was met with apprehension and the threat of legal action if the evaluation was submitted. Some of the facts. Mrs. Stevens was the teacher here. She has shown a very negative and hostile attitude during all the post-evaluation conferences. She doesn't take any responsibility and she blames the principal for sitting in the back and that causing her and her students to have poor performance. She has received negative evaluations for lack of motivating students, her lack of control, and also lack of influence in the classroom. She was recommended for non-renewal. She was very angry over this evaluation and recommendation. She thinks that lack of academic support is the real problem, and she's threatening legal action. The principal, he's the main evaluator. He's really happy with most of his staff except for Mrs. Stevens. He feels that she lacks control and accountability in her classroom and is not motivating her students to learn. He's given Mrs. Stevens a few suggestions in an evaluation conference, but these are met with hostility and anger. He does recommend non-renewal, and he didn't speak with her after the last conference. He just left a note to meet the next day. It happened in Mrs. Stevens' classrooms. It was shown to have lack of control. It was noisy, and the students were defiant. And the post-evaluation conferences happened in the principal's office. It was a quiet, private environment. Let's review and prioritize some of the information. A poor recommendation and non-renewal could really affect Mrs. Stevens. She could lose her job and her source of income. The school and students could also suffer if Mrs. Stevens kept her job. If she is not teaching effectively, and controlling her classroom, then the students are suffering. I'm curious what type of data was used and how this data was used to drive teaching possibilities or education for the teachers. I'm curious if the walkthroughs were the only form of evaluation, or if there are other ways to evaluate teachers in place. And I'm also looking at the school policies and if they were followed and if they need to be reviewed in regards to the evaluation procedures. Mrs. Stevens' attitude is also important in this case. Her excuses and hostility really show a lack of accountability and an unwillingness to grow as a teacher. Everyone involved in this case really has a large stake in it. The teacher could lose her job. The principal has to evaluate efficiently and correctly in order to have quality teachers, and the students need quality instruction, and they're not going to receive that if Mrs. Stevens stays. The main stakeholders really have been consulted. However, I do think the superintendent needs to be made aware of the situation, and if legal action would take place, the Board of Education would also need to get involved. A few questions that I have. I would like to know if there are any school policies about non-renewal and if due process is part of the negotiated agreement, if any other types of evaluation are being used, or are walkthroughs the main method, and is this the first year that Mrs. Stevens is having problems, or has this occurred in previous years and it's just a culmination of everything that's happening? I do believe that without the answers I can make a decision, but if I answered the above questions I could maybe have a better picture of what was actually happening. I have a few options that I'd like to put forth. The first option would be just to cave to Mrs. Stevens and her demands and allow her to continue teaching. Another would be to ignore her outburst, to schedule no additional meetings, and then fire her for her insubordination. I could schedule a meeting with Mrs. Stevens and the superintendent, go over the evaluations with them both, talk about the non-renewal, and then give her a chance to talk about her feelings and what she thinks about the non-renewal. We could review the evaluation procedures and handbook policies. We could review evaluation tools to make sure it's a multi-pronged approach and that ample post-evaluation conferences were being held. And lastly, we could meet with all employees, review their evaluations, go over expectations I have as their principal, and then also look at possible training opportunities to make them better. So let's evaluate these options. Option one was to cave to Mrs. Stevens. I really think this would be a poor idea. You could lose the respect of other teachers. You would be sending a message to teachers and parents that if you yell enough or cause a big enough stink, you could get your way. This could lead to poor school culture and lack of respect. And then also, if she stayed, the students would be receiving a subpar education. In the next option, if you would ignore it and fire her, you would be getting rid of Mrs. Stevens, which could be a positive for your school. However, if policies were not followed, she could take legal action. And then I really just don't think it's the most professional way to end things with a staff member. If we scheduled a meeting with Mrs. Stevens and the superintendent, I think this would allow both sides to talk about their opinions and their thoughts. It would help teachers know that their voice can be heard even if disagreements did occur, and it could allow both parties to come to agreement outside of legal action. If we review evaluation procedures and handbook policies, it would be a good way to stay up to date on what policies are in place. Situations like this can actually help administrators see the strengths and weaknesses of the policies they have in place, and then it would allow for growth for the district to make sure that straightforward policies are in place and that they are something that could benefit everyone. If we review evaluation tools and make sure it's multi-pronged and have sufficient post-evaluation conferences, it would help us to take a look of what's happening in our district and see if things need to change. It could actually help strengthen the evaluation process and help teachers and the administration to collaborate more and to strengthen relationships between those two parties. And anytime you can strengthen communication in the evaluation process, everybody's going to win. And then lastly, if we met with all employees to review their evaluations and go over clear-cut expectations, it would just help communication. Clear expectations would leave no gray areas. It would allow my teachers to have a goal to work towards. If we had increased training opportunities, they could strengthen the skills they have, but also learn new ones. And then enhanced teaching would not only affect our school culture, but also the students that we are serving. So if I look at those options, I think there are 4 that I would choose to proceed with. That would be to schedule that meeting with the superintendent and Mrs. Stevens and to go over the non-renewal, the evaluations, and then let both sides talk. I'd meet with all employees, go over their evaluations, set clear expectations, and then look at training opportunities for them. I would review the evaluation tools that our district uses and make sure that they were sufficient. And then lastly, I would review the evaluation procedures and handbook policies. To implement these, the first thing I would do would be to meet with my superintendent. I would make him aware of the situation and what was happening in the district with this evaluation. Next, I would then schedule a meeting with the superintendent and Mrs. Stevens. This might be a really hard and awkward thing to do, but necessary so that everyone could voice their opinion. We would discuss the reasons for the non-renewal and the evaluations. Mrs. Stevens would then be able to kind of have the floor and talk about her feelings and what she thinks about her critiques and why she does or does not think they're fair. At this point, after having these conversations, we would just kind of see where we were at and if Mrs. Stevens was wanting to pursue any legal action. Next, I would meet with my teachers over the next few weeks to go over their evaluations. I also would like to set clear expectations so that they would have goals to work toward. Then I think in these meetings they could also express any types of concerns. If they know that they can express these things to me, we're going to have a stronger relationship and be able to work through our problems. I think then after I would do this, I would really take a look at how I evaluate and the process the district has me go through. Is it multi-pronged, or is it just kind of a one-step approach to evaluation? And if we need to change things, to look at possible other sources of evaluation. And then lastly, I would like to go through the handbook with the principal, look at the policies and procedures in place, and see if we're following the procedures and policies, or if we need to put anything else in there to make them more straightforward and to really help benefit both the teachers and the district. My final thoughts on this. I don't think that any evaluation tool out there is ever going to be perfect. You constantly have to evaluate what's going to work for you personally, for your teachers, and for your district. And if things aren't working, you can't be afraid to change it up. This would not only help our teachers to grow, but it would help relationships in our building. It would help our school culture be more positive, and it would increase the collaboration, which is going to help everybody win. I also think it's important to know that not all teachers are going to be made equal. Some are really going to just flourish, and some are going to need a lot more help. And so the evaluation process should be one that helps them grow, not just be used as a tool to fire them. And that being said, I think sometimes hard decisions as a principal have to be made. While I am not looking forward to when these things have to be done, I do think if you have strong policies in place, if you're honest throughout the entire process, and you treat teachers with respect, it'll just make it easier for these hard conversations to be had. And if people have to be non-renewed or let go, then we can just work together to try to find the best fit for the teacher. And it really just depends on the trust and respect level you have. And sometimes, unfortunately, they just have to be done. So hopefully that was clear cut. And I really appreciate this class and all the things that has made me think through. And I hope you have a great night. Thanks.